Do you truly know what life was like behind those ancient stone walls? What secrets did the silent sisters hold in their humble cells? From the solemn vows of profession to the quiet slumber of their final rest, medieval convent life, spanning roughly the years 500 to 1500, was governed by strict rules and deep symbolism. Number 12. The veil. The veil, for a medieval nun, was far more than just a piece of cloth. It was the absolute defining feature of her identity, a profound statement visible to anyone who might glimpse her. It was the public declaration of her chosen path, a physical barrier between her former self and her new existence dedicated entirely to God. When a woman entered a convent, she did not immediately receive the full black veil of a professed nun. Her journey began often as a postulant, then a novice, during which time she might wear a simple white veil, or sometimes no veil at all, depending on the specific rule of the order and the traditions of the individual convent. This period of novitiate could last for 1 year, sometimes even longer. A time for the aspirant to discern her true calling and for the community to assess her suitability. It was a probationary period, a time of testing and learning the intricate rhythms of monastic life. The ceremony of receiving the black veil was a solemn and deeply significant event, often taking place after years of preparation. This was known as the profession, a moment akin to a wedding, where the nun-to-be pledged her life to Christ as her spiritual spouse. During this ritual, she would often lie prostrate on the ground, covered by a pall or funeral shroud, symbolizing her death to the world and her rebirth in a new spiritual life. This dramatic gesture reinforced the idea that she was leaving behind all worldly connections, possessions, and desires. After this symbolic death, she would rise, her worldly garments removed, and be clothed in the simple habit of the order, culminating with the ceremonial placement of the black veil upon her head by the abbess or a bishop. This dark, heavy cloth, often made of wool or linen, completely covered her hair, framing her face and obscuring her features, reinforcing humility and a detachment from earthly vanity. For centuries across various orders like the Benedictines, Cistercians, and Poor Clares, the veil's design might vary slightly, perhaps, in its length or how it was draped, but its core purpose remained constant, a symbol of modesty, purity, and absolute devotion. Beyond the initial ceremony, the veil was worn continuously from waking until sleeping, a constant presence that shaped a nun's daily interactions. It signified her sacred status and ensured her anonymity within the cloistered community. There was no need for personal adornment. The veil removed any desire for self-expression through outward appearance. It was a uniform that underscored equality among the sisters, reminding them that in their spiritual journey, individual differences were secondary to their shared commitment. The veil was not merely a practical garment, it was a constant reminder of her vows. When she prayed, the veil framed her face, directing her gaze inward or towards the altar. When she worked in the infirmary or the scriptorium, the veil remained in place, a silent testament to her dedication in all tasks. It was sometimes said that the veil protected the nun's modesty and kept her attention fixed on God, preventing the distractions of the outside world from penetrating the sanctity of her inner spiritual life. Its very presence served as a psychological boundary, reinforcing the convent's separation from secular society. Records from convents across medieval Europe, such as those from Barking Abbey in England or Helfta in Germany, frequently mention the veil in their liturgical instructions and daily routines. The removal of the veil was almost unheard of, save for specific rituals. During certain penitential practices, a nun might temporarily remove her veil as a sign of deep humility or penance, but this was an exception to the rule. Even in death, the veil retained its significance. When a nun passed away, she was typically buried in her habit, her veil still covering her head, a final, permanent symbol of her lifelong commitment and her identity as a bride of Christ. It was a sign that her spiritual journey had reached its ultimate destination, with the veil accompanying her into eternity. The threads of the veil, simple as they might seem, were thus interwoven with every stage of a nun's existence, from her initial aspiration to her final resting place, always present, always signifying her dedication. It was a visible sign, understood by all, of her choice to live a life set apart, consecrated to a higher purpose, and bound by sacred promises. Its symbolic weight was immense, marking her as a member of a sacred community, living under strict rules and dedicated to the spiritual pursuits of the cloister. Number 11. The habit. The habit, the distinctive clothing worn by nuns, was far more than simple attire. It was a uniform that stripped away individual identity and replaced it with a shared commitment to the monastic life. Each order, from the Benedictines to the Cistercians, the Dominicans to the Franciscans, had its own specific habit, recognizable by its color, cut, and accessories. These distinctions were not arbitrary, but were often rooted in the order's history, its founder's vision, or its particular spiritual emphasis. For example, the Benedictine nuns traditionally wore habits of black or dark gray wool, signifying humility and solemnity, echoing the ancient tradition of monasticism. The Cistercian nuns, emerging from a reform movement, adopted habits of undyed wool, sometimes appearing light gray or beige, reflecting their emphasis on simplicity and austerity. These variations, though subtle to the modern eye, were clear markers of belonging and adherence to a particular rule. The materials used for the habit were always simple and unadorned. Coarse wool was a common choice, reflecting vows of poverty and detachment from worldly comforts. This wool was often undyed or dyed in somber colors, like black, gray, or brown, avoiding any suggestion of luxury or personal vanity. The habit usually consisted of a tunic, a long, simple dress worn over an undergarment. Over the tunic, a scapular, a long piece of cloth hanging front and back, was often worn, symbolizing the yoke of Christ and the burden of service. A cincture, or belt, sometimes made of leather or rope, cinched the waist. For some orders, like the Franciscans, this cincture would have 3 knots, symbolizing their vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. These seemingly small details carried profound weight within the community. The act of donning the habit was a significant part of the profession ceremony, alongside receiving the veil. It symbolized a complete transformation, a shedding of the old self, and an embracing of a new identity in Christ. When a woman entered the convent, she would surrender her own clothes, which were often richer and more decorative, and be dressed in the humble, standardized garments of the order. This act underscored her detachment from worldly possessions and her commitment to communal living. The habit was meant to erase distinctions of social class, wealth, or background. Within the convent walls, all sisters, whether from noble families or humble origins, wore the same simple habit, reflecting their equal standing before God. This visual uniformity reinforced the sense of community and shared purpose, emphasizing that personal status no longer mattered. Daily life in the convent meant wearing the habit through all activities: prayer, work, study, and meals. It was designed for practicality and durability, able to withstand the rigors of manual labor, long hours of kneeling in prayer, and constant movement. The fabric might be heavy in winter for warmth and lighter in summer, but always modest and covering. The layers of the habit, particularly in colder climates, provided essential warmth, though comfort was rarely the primary concern. The habit was not just clothing. It was a continuous reminder of the vows taken. Every time a nun dressed, she was reminded of her commitment to poverty, chastity, and obedience. The absence of pockets, the lack of personal embellishments, and the modest cut all reinforced these spiritual principles. Historical accounts, such as the Chronicles of the Convent of Heatingham in England or St. Radigan's Foundation at Poitiers, detailed the strictures around the habit. Nuns were not permitted to alter their habits for personal style or comfort beyond what was necessary for modesty and practicality. Any attempts to do so would have been considered a breach of the rule and a sign of worldly attachment. The habit was not a fashion statement. It was a sacred garment. Even minor repairs were often done with a focus on utility rather than aesthetics, preserving the simple, unadorned nature of the clothing. In some ways, the habit functioned as a portable cloister, physically enclosing the nun in her consecrated state even when she might be outside the walls of the convent on permitted errands, such as visiting the sick or tending to convent property. It projected an image of piety and sacred devotion to the outside world, immediately identifying the wearer as a consecrated religious woman. The habit served as a constant external and internal reminder of the sacred promises that defined the life of a medieval nun. Number 10. The ring. The ring, though perhaps less immediately visible than the habit or veil, held profound symbolic weight for a medieval nun. It was a tangible sign of her mystical marriage to Christ. Unlike a wedding ring in secular society, which symbolized a union between two individuals, the nun's ring signified her singular, lifelong dedication to God, becoming His spiritual bride. This concept of the bride of Christ was central to medieval female monasticism and was deeply rooted in biblical imagery, particularly from the Song of Songs, which was interpreted allegorically as the soul's love for Christ. Profession ceremony for a nun was often explicitly likened to a wedding, complete with white garments worn before the habit and the solemn exchange of vows. The ring itself was usually a simple plain band typically made of silver or gold, reflecting humility and the absence of worldly ostentation. It might be inscribed with a cross or a monogram of Christ's name, such as IH is from the Greek word for Jesus, Isis, reinforcing its sacred purpose. The design rarely featured precious jewels or elaborate craftsmanship, aligning with the monastic vows of poverty and detachment from earthly wealth. It was not a piece of adornment to be admired, but a spiritual emblem to be cherished internally. The ring was presented to the nun during the solemn profession ceremony, often placed on her ring finger by the abbess or a bishop, echoing the ritual of a traditional marriage. This act was accompanied by specific liturgical prayers and blessings, consecrating the ring as a symbol of her eternal bond. The significance of the ring was multifaceted. First, it was a constant physical reminder of her vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Every time she glimpsed the ring on her finger, she was reminded of her lifelong commitment to these principles. It underscored her fidelity to Christ alone, rejecting earthly marriage and familial ties in favor of a spiritual union. Second, the ring served as an emblem of her new spiritual status within the community and in the eyes of God. Conferred a unique dignity, recognizing her as a consecrated woman set apart for divine service. This was not merely an individual pledge, but a public affirmation of her belonging to the community of consecrated women. Third, it symbolized the spiritual intimacy and communion with Christ that was at the heart of her religious life. This mystical union was seen as the highest form of love and devotion, promising eternal bliss and a deep personal relationship with the divine. Historical records from various convents, such as those associated with Saint Clare of Assisi or the early Dominican nuns, frequently highlight the importance of the ring. For instance, the rule of Saint Clare emphasized simplicity in all things, extending even to the profession ring, which would have been unadorned. Some accounts tell of nuns who wore their rings even into death, a final testament to their lifelong devotion, mirroring the custom of burying married women with their wedding bands. The ring became a part of the nun's body, almost an extension of her consecrated self, signifying her sacred identity. It was not merely a piece of jewelry that could be removed. It was an integral part of her being as a bride of Christ. The ring was rarely removed once given. It was a permanent fixture, an outward sign of an inner transformation. In the rare instances when a nun might leave the convent, the ring would typically be removed, symbolizing the breaking of her vows and the end of her consecrated status. This reinforced the ring's direct connection to her sacred promises. The ring functioned as a quiet yet powerful symbol of identity, loyalty, and spiritual intimacy. It was a profound marker of devotion, a sign of her complete offering of herself to God, and a testament to the enduring power of symbolic objects in medieval religious life. It bound her not to an earthly partner, but to a divine one, promising a spiritual union that transcended the temporal world. Number 9. The cross. Cross, in its myriad forms, was undeniably the most pervasive and fundamental symbol in medieval convent life, representing the core of Christian faith and the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. For nuns, the cross was not just an emblem of belief. It was a constant presence integrated into every aspect of their daily existence, from personal devotion to communal liturgy and the very architecture of their sacred spaces. It was the ultimate reminder of suffering, redemption, and the path to salvation. The most common form of the cross seen by nuns was the crucifix, a cross bearing the figure of Christ. This specific depiction emphasized Jesus' human suffering and his redemptive death, inviting contemplation, compassion, and a deep sense of identification with his sacrifice. Nuns would typically wear a small cross or crucifix on their person, often suspended from their cincture or around their neck, beneath their habit. This personal cross was a constant tactile reminder of their vows and their spiritual spouse, Christ. When they prayed, they might hold it, trace its form, or gaze upon it, allowing its presence to deepen their meditation on suffering and salvation. It was a tangible anchor for their faith in a world that often presented challenges and temptations. Beyond personal wear, larger crucifixes adorned every convent church, end of chapter room, and often individual cells. These communal crosses served as focal points for prayer, liturgical processions, and daily contemplation. The artistic style of these crucifixes varied widely across the medieval period, from the more triumphant, less suffering representations of the early Middle Ages to the more starkly realistic and emotionally charged depictions of the later Gothic period, which aimed to evoke empathy and devotion. The symbolism for the cross was multifold for nuns. It represented obedience and humility, as Christ humbly submitted to his Father's will even unto death. For nuns, who vowed obedience to their abbess and to God, this was a powerful example. It also symbolized suffering and penance, reminding them that their own lives of asceticism and self-denial were a way of participating in Christ's passion. Through embracing physical hardships, long hours of prayer, and strict diets, nuns aimed to imitate Christ's suffering, believing it brought them closer to divine grace. Cross was also a symbol of victory over sin and death, offering hope and the promise of resurrection. This eschatological aspect provided comfort and motivation for their rigorous lives, pointing towards eternal life. Every major event in the convent's liturgical calendar centered on the cross, from the solemn observances of Holy Week, particularly Good Friday, to daily Mass. During these rituals, nuns would often venerate the cross, kissing it or kneeling before it, expressing their profound devotion and gratitude. The architectural layout of a convent church itself was typically cruciform, meaning it was built in the shape of a cross, further integrating the symbol into the very structure of their communal worship space. This ensured that the cross was not merely an object, but an encompassing spiritual environment. Even in their daily labor, such as working in the scriptorium, nuns might illuminate manuscripts with elaborate crosses, or their prayers and readings would constantly reference biblical passages about the cross. When a nun fell ill, a crucifix would often be placed near her bed, offering solace and strength in her suffering. At the moment of death, it was customary for a crucifix to be held before her eyes, guiding her final gaze towards redemption. Cross, therefore, was a constant, inescapable, and profound symbol for medieval nuns. It was their spiritual guide, their object of contemplation, their source of strength in adversity, and their ultimate hope. It embodied their entire spiritual journey, from the moment of their entry into the convent until their final breath, serving as a silent, unwavering testament to the faith that structured and defined their existence. Cross was a permanent fixture in their landscape, both physical and spiritual, permeating their thoughts, their prayers, and their every action, underscoring their commitment to a life patterned after the ultimate act of self-sacrifice. Number 8. The Rosary Beads. The rosary beads, though their specific form and widespread use evolved throughout the Middle Ages, became an increasingly significant devotional tool for medieval nuns, especially from the later medieval period onwards. These strings of beads served as a practical aid for meditation and prayer, allowing nuns to keep count of repeated prayers, primarily the Hail Mary and the Our Father, while focusing their minds on specific mysteries of the Christian faith. Before the standardized 5-decade rosary became common, various forms of prayer beads or paternosters existed, ranging from simple strings of knotted rope to more elaborate beads carved from wood, bone, or even precious materials depending on the status of the convent before entering. For nuns, many of whom were educated in Latin and could read their psalters and breviaries, the rosary offered a different pathway to prayer that complemented the formal liturgical hours. It allowed for a more personal and continuous form of devotion, accessible even during manual labor or quiet contemplation. The practice of reciting a set number of prayers, often equivalent to the 150 psalms of the Psalter, hence the Marian Psalter or poor man's Psalter, was a way for those who might not have had extensive literary training, or even those who did, to engage deeply with sacred texts and events. Each bead served as a tangible marker, guiding the nun through cycles of prayer and meditation, keeping her mind focused and preventing distraction. The physical act of holding and moving the beads between her fingers was itself a meditative experience, provided a rhythmic, tactile element to prayer, anchoring the mind and body. This physical engagement helped in achieving a state of spiritual concentration, especially during long periods of silent reflection. Texture, weight, and material of the beads would become intimately familiar to the nun who used them daily, associating them with countless hours of devotion. Some nuns might have even made their own beads from local materials, further investing a personal connection to their devotional object. Presence of the rosary beads, whether carried in the hand or tucked into a pocket of the habit, also served as a constant, quiet reminder of their spiritual purpose, prompting spontaneous moments of prayer throughout the day. The mysteries of the rosary, which involved meditating on events from the lives of Jesus and Mary, joyful, sorrowful, and glorious mysteries, provided a structured framework for contemplation. As a nun recited her Hail Marys, she would reflect on moments like the Annunciation, the Crucifixion, or the Resurrection. This allowed her to imaginatively enter into these sacred narratives, fostering a deeper spiritual connection and emotional engagement with the story of salvation. This form of prayer was particularly suited to the contemplative life, encouraging introspection and a profound interior journey. It was a way for nuns to not just recite words, but to actively participate in the mysteries of their faith, integrating theological concepts into their daily lived experience. While the earliest formalized rosary tradition is often linked to the Dominicans in the 13th century, various forms of bead-counting prayers existed before this, and their popularity grew throughout the later Middle Ages, especially in convents. Records from convents like Sion Abbey in England, a Brigittine foundation, show how deeply ingrained such practices became. The Brigittine rule, for instance, emphasized devotion to the Virgin Mary, and the Rosary became a natural extension of this focus, offering a structured way to honor her. The rosary beads, therefore, were not merely counting devices. They were powerful tools for spiritual discipline, memory, and profound meditation, enabling nuns to cultivate a continuous state of prayer and contemplation, always bringing their minds back to the sacred narratives that underpinned their entire world. They became an indispensable companion in their quest for spiritual union with the divine, a silent witness to countless moments of devotion. Number 7. The book. The book, in medieval convent life, was a powerful symbol of knowledge, devotion, and a very foundation of monastic existence. Far from being mere objects, books were sacred conduits to divine wisdom, liturgical texts, and the intellectual life of the cloister. For nuns, access to books meant access to prayer, study, and the preservation of sacred tradition. The most important book in any convent was the Bible, or portions of it, often in Latin, the universal language of the Church. The Psalter, a collection of the Psalms, was particularly central, forming the backbone of the divine office, the daily cycle of prayers that governed the nuns' lives. Every nun was expected to know the Psalter by heart, or at least be familiar with its contents, as she would recite it communally multiple times a day. Beyond the Bible, other essential books included the Breviary, which contained the texts for the divine office for the entire liturgical year, and the Missal, which held the prayers and readings for the Mass. The Rule of the Order, such as the Rule of St. Benedict, was another foundational text guiding every aspect of the nuns' daily lives, from how they ate and slept to how they prayed and worked. These core texts were not just read, they were lived. Their words dictated the rhythm of communal life and informed the nuns' understanding of their spiritual purpose. Reading these books was not a passive activity but an active engagement with sacred wisdom, shaping their thoughts and guiding their actions. Many convents housed scriptoria, dedicated rooms where nuns copied and illuminated manuscripts. This was not merely a practical task, but a spiritual discipline, seen as a form of prayer and devotion. Nuns meticulously transcribed sacred texts, patristic writings, and sometimes even secular works. The act of copying itself was considered an act of humility and service, preserving knowledge for future generations. The beautiful illuminations, intricate calligraphy, and carefully bound pages were testaments to the devotion and skill of the scribble nuns. Examples from convents like Quedlinburg in Germany or the Beguinages of Flanders show that nuns were highly literate and played a significant role in the production and preservation of books during a time when literacy was not widespread, especially among women outside the cloister. Access to books also meant intellectual engagement. Nuns were often among the most educated women of their era. Many convents maintained libraries, some quite extensive, containing theological treatises, lives of saints, commentaries on scripture, and sometimes even works of classical literature. These libraries were centers of learning, allowing nuns to delve deeper into spiritual mysteries and broaden their understanding of the world through a religious lens. For nuns who were able to read and study books provided a pathway to contemplative thought, enabling them to ponder theological questions, engage in spiritual direction through written texts, and connect with a broader intellectual tradition. A nun's cell, though simple, would often contain a small shelf for her few permitted books, allowing for private study and reflection. The book was also a symbol of wisdom and spiritual nourishment. Just as food sustained the body, the words of scripture and holy writings nourished the soul. Reading was often framed as a form of spiritual eating, digesting divine truths. The careful handling of books, the reverence shown to them, and the precious materials used in their creation underscored their sacred value. A book was never simply discarded. It was a treasure to be preserved, corrected, and copied. In an age before widespread printing, every book was a labor of love and a precious commodity, imbued with spiritual significance. Thus, for medieval nuns, the book was central to their liturgical life, their intellectual pursuits, and their personal spiritual growth, representing both the wisdom they sought and the knowledge they helped to preserve for future generations within their cloistered world. Number 6. The bell. The bell, in a medieval convent, was the undisputed master of time, the unyielding conductor of daily life, and a constant sonic symbol of order and divine presence. Its resonant summons dictated the rhythm of every sister's existence, from the first hesitant chime before dawn to the final toll before nightfall. The sound of the convent bell was not just a signal. It was a command, a call to worship, work, and rest, structuring the hours and minutes with an unwavering authority. The primary purpose of the bell was to mark the canonical hours, the specific times of prayer throughout the day and night. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided most Western monastic orders, meticulously laid out 7 daytime hours and 1 nighttime hour for communal prayer, known as the Divine Office. The bell would ring for matins, often in the deepest hours of the night, rousing the nuns from sleep to gather in the choir. Then again, for lauds at dawn, prime, at the first hour of daylight, terce at the 3rd, sext at the 6th, none at the 9th, vespers in the late afternoon, and compline before bed. Each ringing sequence had its own distinct pattern or number of tolls, instantly recognizable to the nuns, signaling the precise moment to cease their current activity and proceed to the church or oratory. This constant, precise scheduling ensured that prayer remained at the absolute center of convent life, weaving through every other activity. The sound of the bell was an ever-present reminder of their vows and their commitment to ceaseless prayer for the world. Beyond its liturgical function, the bell also regulated secular activities within the cloister. It would signal the start and end of periods of work in the scriptorium, the garden, or the infirmary. It might announce meal times in the refectory, the beginning of silence, or the time for chapter meetings where convent business was discussed. For example, chronicles from the Convent of Las Huelgas in Spain detail how the bell regulated not only the prayers but also the complex administrative duties undertaken by the abbess and her sisters, indicating the shift between different communal responsibilities. The bell ensured uniformity and discipline, preventing individual sisters from drifting off schedule and maintaining the collective harmony of the community. Its voice was impartial, calling all nuns equally, regardless of their role or seniority. The ringing of the bell was often performed by a designated nun, sometimes the sacristan, who was responsible for the church and its sacred objects. This duty was precise and important, as the accurate timing of the bells was crucial for the proper execution of the divine office and the smooth functioning of the entire convent. The bell itself was often a large, heavy object, suspended in a bell tower or belfry, a prominent architectural feature of any convent. Its casting was often a significant undertaking, involving skilled craftsmen and blessed by the church, imbuing the bell with a sacred character. The sound of the bell carried far beyond the convent walls, signifying the presence of a religious community to the surrounding countryside. It was a sound that marked time for local villagers as well, indicating the hour for their own prayers, or simply serving as a backdrop to their agricultural lives. In times of danger, the bell might also ring a special peal serving as an alarm, warning the community of fire, invasion, or other emergencies. This added another layer to its symbolic meaning, not only a regulator of peace and order, but also a protector. The bell's voice was in essence the voice of the convent itself, speaking to its inhabitants and to the world beyond its gates. It was a constant, sonorous presence, knitting together the moments of each day into a cohesive pattern of prayer and devotion, ensuring that every sister lived in accordance with the strict, sacred timetable that defined her consecrated life. The bell was an auditory symbol of divine order imposed on earthly time, a constant reminder of God's presence and the monastic commitment to live every moment in His service. Number 5. The lamp. The lamp, or more commonly a candle or oil lamp, was a profound symbol in medieval convent life, representing not just physical light but also spiritual illumination, vigilance, and the continuous presence of prayer. In an era before electricity, light sources were precious and carefully managed. The flame of a lamp in the cloister was a constant reminder of the spiritual light of Christ and the unceasing prayer of the nuns, even in the darkest hours of the night. Lamps were essential for numerous activities, especially given the strict schedule of monastic life, which often involved waking for prayer in the pre-dawn hours. Nuns would rise for matins and lauds when the world outside was still shrouded in darkness. Lamps illuminated the choir stalls in the convent church, allowing the sisters to read their psalters and breviaries for the divine office. Without this artificial light, communal prayer in the dead of night would have been impossible. Beyond the church, lamps were used in the scriptorium, the copying room, where nuns might labor for long hours transcribing texts, illuminating manuscripts, or engaged in scholarly pursuits. The delicate work of calligraphy and detailed artwork required focused light, and the flickering flame of an oil lamp or candle provided this essential illumination, albeit often dimly. The act of tending the lamps, ensuring they had enough oil or wax, and keeping wicks trimmed was a small but constant duty for some nuns, reflecting their care for the sacred space and their commitment to facilitating communal life. Even in individual cells, though austere and often unheated, a nun might have a small lamp or a stub of a candle for personal prayer, study, or simple tasks like mending. This personal light represented her private, devotional life, a flickering beacon in the darkness of her solitary contemplation. The symbolism of the lamp extended far beyond its practical utility. In Christian theology, light is often associated with Christ, who is called the light of the world. For nuns, the constant presence of lamps, especially those kept burning before altars or sacred relics, represented the enduring presence of God and the unending light of faith. The monastic life was often characterized by vigilance or keeping watch, a spiritual discipline inspired by biblical passages about being ready for the return of Christ. The lamp, therefore, symbolized this spiritual watchfulness, a readiness to meet the divine bridegroom at any moment. The flame of the lamp was also a metaphor for the human soul, burning brightly with faith and devotion. Maintaining a steady flame was akin to maintaining a steady spiritual life, requiring constant effort and nourishment. Historical accounts from convents, such as those from the monastery of Saint Benoît at Orleans or the Brigittine Foundation at Sion Abbey, sometimes describe the procurement of oil or wax for lamps as a significant expenditure and logistical challenge, underscoring their importance. Care with which these resources were managed reflects the reverence given to light as both a necessity and a sacred symbol. Perpetual lamps, kept burning day and night in specific holy places within the convent, signified continuous prayer and adoration, a constant offering to God from the community. These lamps were not just functional, they were powerful visual reminders of the convent's sacred mission, a silent testament to the nuns' dedication to a life of prayer and spiritual vigilance. The gentle glow of the lamps through the windows of the convent at night also served as a visible sign to the outside world, signaling the presence of a community devoted to prayer and the unwavering light of faith, a beacon in a world often shrouded in spiritual and literal darkness. Number 4. The pen and parchment. The pen and parchment for medieval nuns were not mere tools, but vital extensions of their intellectual and spiritual lives, symbolizing knowledge, literacy, and the invaluable role many convents played in the preservation and creation of culture. While not every nun engaged in scribble work, many convents were centers of learning, housing scriptoria where nuns dedicated themselves to the meticulous art of copying, illuminating, and sometimes even composing texts. The very act of taking a pen, often a sharpened quill from a bird's feather, and applying ink to specially prepared animal skin or parchment was a sacred task, a tangible expression of devotion and discipline. Parchment, usually made from the stretched and scraped skins of sheep, calves, or goats, was a precious and expensive material. Its preparation was laborious, requiring meticulous cleaning, stretching, and smoothing to create a surface suitable for writing. Quality of the parchment varied, affecting the final appearance of the manuscript. The inks, often made from lamp black, oak galls, or various minerals and plants, were also carefully prepared, with vibrant colors used for initial letters and illuminations. Pen, requiring constant sharpening and careful handling, demanded precision and patience. Combination of these materials and tools underscored the value and solemnity of the work being undertaken. Primary task of scribble nuns was the copying of sacred texts. This included Bibles, psalters, liturgical books like missals and breviaries, and the rules of their monastic orders. By faithfully transcribing these texts, nuns ensured their preservation and dissemination, contributing significantly to the continuation of Christian doctrine and practice. This was not a mechanical process. It was considered a form of prayer, a meditative act, where each stroke of the pen reaffirmed their devotion to the divine word. Benedictine rule, for instance, emphasized the importance of manual labor, and for many nuns, copying manuscripts was a valued form of such work, blending intellectual pursuit with spiritual discipline. Beyond copying, some nuns were also skilled illuminators, adding intricate designs, decorative borders, and miniature paintings to the manuscripts. These illuminations, often depicting biblical scenes, saints, or symbolic motifs, transformed functional texts into works of art. The vibrant colors and gold leaf used in these illustrations made the books objects of profound beauty and reverence, enriching the spiritual experience of those who used them. Convents like the double monastery of Gandersheim in Germany or Chelles Abbey in France were renowned for their scribble and artistic output, demonstrating the high level of literacy and artistic talent present within these cloistered communities. These works were not just for internal use. They were sometimes commissioned by patrons or exchanged with other religious houses, spreading their influence. Furthermore, some nuns were authors in their own right, composing spiritual treatises, letters, hymns, and even historical chronicles. Visionary nuns, such as Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess from Germany, used the pen to record their profound spiritual experiences, theological insights, and scientific observations, creating a significant body of written work that continues to be studied today. Other nuns might have kept obituaries documenting the lives and deaths of their sisters or chronicles of their convent's history. Pen and parchment, therefore, were not merely instruments of copying. They were instruments of thought, creativity, and spiritual expression. They symbolized the intellectual rigor and cultural contributions of medieval nuns, highlighting their role as custodians of knowledge and active participants in the intellectual and spiritual landscape of their time, leaving behind a tangible legacy of their dedication and learning. Number 3. The spade. The spade, or a similar gardening implement like a hoe, was a surprisingly potent symbol in medieval convent life, representing manual labor, self-sufficiency, humility, and a deep connection to the earth and its produce. While not as overtly spiritual as the cross or the book, the spade underscored the practical realities of monastic existence and the profound spiritual value placed on physical work, especially the cultivation of food and medicinal herbs. For many medieval convents, particularly those adhering to the rule of Saint Benedict, manual labor was an integral part of the daily schedule. The rule stated that idleness was the enemy of the soul, and physical work, whether in the kitchen, the laundry, the scriptorium, or the garden, was seen as a way to avoid sloth and engage in a productive, disciplined life. The convent garden, often enclosed within the cloister walls, was a vital space. It was here that nuns used the spade to till the soil, plant seeds, weed beds, and harvest crops. This garden was not merely ornamental, it was a practical necessity, providing a significant portion of the convent's food supply. Vegetables, fruits, and grains grown by the nuns supplemented their diets and reduced their reliance on outside resources, embodying the principle of self-sufficiency. This direct engagement with the earth, the cycle of planting and harvesting and the reliance on God's bounty for sustenance, fostered a sense of gratitude and humility. Connected the nuns directly to the processes of creation and nourishment. Beyond food, convent gardens were also essential for cultivating medicinal herbs. Nuns often served as healers and caregivers, not only for their own community, but sometimes for the local populace as well. The infirmary of a convent would rely on the herbal remedies grown and prepared by the sisters. The spade was the tool that enabled them to cultivate these vital plants, from soothing balms to fever-reducing concoctions. This practical aspect of gardening highlighted the nuns' role in ministering to both spiritual and physical needs. The act of digging, planting, and tending the earth also served as a form of meditation and spiritual exercise. It required patience, perseverance, and a willingness to get one's hands dirty, echoing the humility and hard work expected in monastic life. The physical exertion offered a contrast to the long hours of prayer and intellectual study, providing balance to the daily routine. The symbolism of the spade also connected to the spiritual concept of cultivation within the soul. Just as the earth needed to be tilled and weeded to produce good fruit, so too did the soul need constant spiritual effort to grow in virtue and shed vices. The spade became a metaphor for digging out the roots of sin, preparing the heart to receive divine grace, and cultivating the fruits of the Holy Spirit. Cards from convents like those of the Poor Clares, who emphasized strict poverty and manual labor, often detailed the importance of working with their own hands to sustain themselves. The act of using a spade was a direct fulfillment of their vow of poverty, as it implied laboring for their own needs rather than relying on external wealth or servants. Ultimately, the spade, simple as it was, represented the grounding of spiritual life in tangible reality. It was a reminder that holiness was not just an abstract concept, but was lived out in the daily grind of physical labor, in caring for the earth, and in contributing to the sustenance of the community. It underscored the monastic value of working with creation, acknowledging God's providence, and finding spiritual meaning in the most humble of tasks. The spade connected the nuns to the ancient rhythms of agricultural life, reminding them that even in their cloistered existence they were part of a larger divine order, sustained by the earth and by their own diligent labor. Number 2. The cell. The cell for a medieval nun was not merely a private room, but a profound symbol of solitude, introspection, and her dedication to a life separated from the world. It was her personal space within the communal cloister, a sanctuary for prayer study and contemplation, reflecting the intense focus on inner spiritual life that defined monasticism. While the concept of a cell might evoke images of stark imprisonment to some, for a nun it was typically a simple small chamber, providing just enough space for a bed, a small table or desk, and perhaps a bench, or a few shelves for her few permitted books and devotional items. It was designed for utility and to discourage any form of worldly comfort or luxury. The layout and amenities of cells varied somewhat between orders and across centuries. Early Benedictine monasteries might have had more open dormitory-style sleeping arrangements, but over time individual cells became more common, particularly in later medieval foundations, like the Brigittine order, which stipulated private cells. These cells were usually clustered around the cloister garth, allowing easy access to the church for communal prayers and to other essential convent areas, like the refectory or chapter room. The very design of the cell underscored the vow of poverty. There were no personal possessions beyond the essentials, no elaborate decorations, and certainly no means of personal wealth or display. The focus was on spiritual enrichment, not material comfort. primary function of the cell was to provide a space for quiet, solitude, essential for a nun's spiritual growth. While communal life was central to the convent, private reflection and personal prayer were equally vital. The cell offered a haven from the constant interaction of communal living, allowing the nun to engage in deep self-examination, meditate on scripture, and cultivate a personal relationship with God. It was a place for interior work, for wrestling with doubts, for offering up intentions, and for nurturing her spiritual understanding. The silence of the cell was meant to quiet the external world, making space for the inner voice of conscience and divine inspiration. The cell also represented detachment from the world and its distractions. It reinforced the nun's commitment to live in the world, but not of it, even within the confines of the cloister. The physical separation of the cell from other communal spaces symbolized the psychological and spiritual separation from worldly concerns. It was a space where temptations could be resisted, where one could truly be alone with God. For some nuns, their cell also served as a small study or workspace. They might have a simple desk where they could read, write, or engage in other forms of intellectual or devotional labor, depending on the rules of their order and their personal talents. For example, some nuns might have used their cells for contemplative reading of the Church Fathers, or for journaling their spiritual insights. When a nun died, her body might be laid out in her cell, before being taken to the church for the funeral rites, and then buried in the convent cemetery. This final use of the cell highlighted its significance as a space of life, prayer, and ultimately the transition to eternal rest. The cell, therefore, was far more than just a room. It was a deeply symbolic space, embodying the essence of monastic discipline, the pursuit of spiritual intimacy, and the profound commitment to a life of solitude and contemplation that characterized the medieval nun's existence. It was a personal sanctuary, a microcosm of the entire cloistered world, designed to facilitate a continuous journey towards spiritual perfection and a deeper union with the divine. Number 1. The winding sheet. The winding sheet, also known as a shroud or burial cloth, was a deeply significant, albeit somber, symbol in medieval convent life, representing ultimate humility, detachment from earthly possessions, and the final transition from temporal existence to eternal life. For a nun, the winding sheet was not just a practical garment for the deceased. It was an active participant in her spiritual journey, symbolizing her embrace of death as the final act of total surrender to God, and her expectation of resurrection. The monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were lived every day, but the winding sheet marked their definitive culmination. In medieval Christian belief, death was not seen as an end, but as a passage, a doorway to the afterlife. For nuns, who had already embraced a symbolic death to the world at their profession, their physical death was the ultimate fulfillment of that initial pledge. The winding sheet, a simple piece of linen or wool, often unbleached and unadorned, directly reflected the vow of poverty. It was the antithesis of worldly finery or status. When a nun passed away, her body would be prepared for burial by her sisters. This was a communal act, performed with reverence and piety. Her body would typically be washed and then clothed in her full habit, including her veil and cincture, just as she had lived. The winding sheet would then be carefully wrapped around her, binding her in her monastic attire for her final repose. The act of being wrapped in a simple cloth connected the nun to the most ancient Christian burial traditions, echoing the shrouding of Christ himself. It symbolized absolute equality in death, erasing all earthly distinctions of rank or background that might have existed before entering the convent. Regardless of whether a nun came from a noble family or a peasant background, she would be laid to rest in the same simple manner, bound by the same humble cloth. This reinforced the idea that, before God, all souls were equal in their humility and their dependence on divine mercy. The winding sheet was a powerful visual reminder of the fleeting nature of life and the ultimate destiny of all humanity. For the living nuns, preparing a sister for burial and witnessing her being enshrouded served as a stark memento mori, a reminder of their own mortality and the constant need for spiritual preparedness. It encouraged them to live each day fully in accordance with their vows, knowing that their own time would also come. Historical accounts, such as the Chronicles of the Convent of Helfta, where mystics like Saint Gertrude the Great and Saint Mechtele of Hackeborn lived, show how deeply embedded the understanding of death and the preparation for it were in monastic spirituality. Nuns often meditated on death, not with fear, but as a desired union with Christ. They might even pray for a good death, a peaceful passing in a state of grace. The winding sheet was the final, tangible object that facilitated this journey. The burial itself would typically take place in the convent cemetery, a consecrated ground within the cloister walls, further emphasizing the continuity of the community even in death. The deceased sister remained a part of the monastic family, awaiting the resurrection alongside her sisters. The winding sheet, therefore, was the ultimate symbol of detachment, reflecting the nun's complete surrender of her earthly self and her joyful expectation of spiritual resurrection. It spoke of humility, of poverty, and of the final unwavering trust in God's eternal promise. It was the last garment she would ever wear, a silent testament to a life lived entirely for Christ, culminating in a peaceful return to her divine spouse, embraced not by earthly finery, but by the simple cloth of eternal humility.